On this episode of Newt's World, Wilbur Ross rose to prominence as the king of bankruptcy and then served as U.S. Secretary of Commerce. But few people know his story and the lessons we can all learn from it. In his new book, Risks and Returns, Creating Success in Business and Life, Ross chronicles his life from his humble beginnings in New Jersey to his time at Yale and Harvard Business School to his storied 55-year career on Wall Street, where he helped to restructure more than $400 billion in assets, and finally, to his 4 years as Secretary of Commerce under former President Donald Trump. He's a great friend for close to me, and we're always delighted to see Wilbur and Hillary. So I am really pleased to welcome my guest, Wilbur Ross. He did serve as Secretary of Commerce in the Trump administration. His experience for 55 years in investment banking and private equity is remarkable, and in this capacity, he advised Donald Trump, the businessman, on commercial and economic affairs and helped American entrepreneurs and businesses create jobs and economic opportunity. In 2011, Bloomberg Markets named him one of the 50 most influential people in global finance. It is great to have you join us.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker.
And I'm delighted to report that Risk and Returns made the USA Today bestseller list this week, so congratulations.
Well, thank you very much.
You have led a really fascinating life, and I thought maybe we could start with your early years and some of the lessons that your parents taught you about the importance of hard work and dedication. What was it like growing up in New Jersey?
Well, North Bergen was barely a middle-class town, and my dad was part of a little two-man law firm until he died at a fairly early age, and my mom was a third-grade school teacher until she was forced to retire at 71 by the union rules.
Obviously, she must have loved teaching.
Yes. And they sent me to a Jesuit military school for high school because it was felt then, and is probably still true now, that I needed more discipline.
Did it work?
Well, I made it through life, so I guess it worked.
So you would recommend a family that has a challenged child that something like a Jesuit military school would be a reasonable step towards salvation?
Well, it is, and it was very good in terms of the educational program. They required you to take two languages, in my case, Latin and German. And on the college boards, I did well enough in German that Yale exempted me from its 2-year language requirement. So that shows what good teachers they were.
That's great. And your dad had, as I understand it, actually had spent a lot of his legal career helping immigrants who were here legally go through the process of becoming Americans.
That is true, and that taught me a lesson which I really picked up on again when I was in government, in that once in a while I would get to swear in newly naturalized citizens, and it was heartwarming. First of all, they know more about our history, our Constitution, and all that than most college students do today. And that's a different problem, but it's a serious one. And they were so proud to become Americans, there would be tears in their eyes as I swore them in, happy tears. It was a very heartwarming experience.
Did you get to go to some of those with your dad?
Oh, yeah. I did them particularly in Florida. And a lot of them were Latin American people. But the important message to me was that unlike many of our youths today who had no idea of American history, many of them were asked by a Midwestern university a couple of questions, one of which was, who was Andrew Jackson? You know what the most popular answer was?
What?
Michael's brother.
Okay. The power of modern culture. You were growing up during World War II. How did that great conflict affect you?
Well, it affected me in a couple of ways. My father was an air raid warden, so he would put on a little tin hat at night when there was an air raid warning and go out in our neighborhood and tell people, turn their lights off, because it was believed that if you left lights on and there was a bombing attack, it would make you an easy target. So he did that. The other strange thing it did, it was my first exposure to China, in that my mom would stand on line for getting bananas. Bananas were in short supply because of the war, and I didn't like bananas. So she kept saying to me, eat your bananas, think about the poor starving children in China. And I could never figure out how my eating bananas was going to help the poor starving children in China. Still can't figure it out.
My parents used the same thing, and I'm with you. I'd sit there thinking, well, if I don't eat this, it's not going to get to China. But apparently, for our generation, it was apparently a universal thing for parents to tell their kids, you have to eat this because there's some starving kids somewhere.
Right.
You have one, I think, interesting story about going through an air raid drill and being asked, why does everyone have to sit against the wall?
Oh, yeah. I was in kindergarten at the time, and about every week they would have an air raid drill, and they would march us all down to the basement of the school building and have us sit against the wall. And at one point, teacher asked, does anybody know why we're having you sit against the wall? And what came into my mind, not trying to be a wise guy, but just popped in, was, well, I said, maybe it's to make it easier to count the bodies. That made the teacher furious and some of the other students hysterical.
And you just reached that conclusion as an act of logic?
Right.
When you do get to Yale, you're not immediately on a business track where your career ended up. In fact, you had a very different initial sense of what you might do with your life. Can you describe your early career goals at Yale?
Surely. I wanted to be a writer. And so you could say that now, 60-odd years later, that dream has been fulfilled. But what happened at the time was in second year, they had a course called Daily Themes, and you had to put into a little slot 1,000 words of fiction every day. Well, by the end of the second week, I was out of material, so I quit the course and gave up creative writing. And then a faculty member who was our advisor at my fraternity, but was also part of the Yale investment team, which was a very high rate of return team, called me and said he was leaving the university to go to Wall Street and that I shouldn't waste my summer parking cars, which I had done the prior summer. I should instead accompany him as his clerk to Wall Street, and I did. And once I was there, I never wanted to leave.
But now, the summer before, you parked cars at the Monmouth Park Club. What did you learn from that experience?
Well, learned a couple of things, all of which were very strange lessons. The very first day, the lot boss brought all of us kids who were car parkers together, and he said, now you got to understand what the rules are here. He said, there will inevitably be accidents, headlights broken, things like that, especially in the rush to get cars out at the end of the day. He said, but if the patron leaves the track without complaining, then the track won't have to pay to fix the damage, and you won't get set down for a week. But if the patron notices the damage, track will pay and you'll get set down for a week. He said, but there's a solution. Distract the customer. And the way he explained to us to distract him was, if it were a convertible, put the top up as you're going to pick him up. The patron would then say, what are you doing putting the top up? and he wouldn't notice that his right front headlight was smashed out. And he said, and if it wasn't a convertible, turn the radio on real loud and turn the windshield wipers on. The patron again will say, what are you doing? It's a sunny day. Why are you putting the windshield wipers? Why are you putting the radio so loud? But he wouldn't notice the damage. So here was an executive, a member of management, teaching young kids how to fleece the customers that kept the place going. In retrospect, a very bizarre experience.
Did you decide that that wasn't the way you wanted to run your business?
No, that's absolutely true.
But you also talk about the fact that having watched casinos and racetracks, you really have a very different attitude about investing in that you don't gamble. You do research.
Well, people think I gamble every day dealing in distressed securities, but those are rational gambles. Gambling in a casino or a racetrack is a loser's game because the odds are set to return only 75% of the money. So whatever gets wagered, 25% of it's going to get eaten up by the establishment. That's not very good odds.
When you look at, say, distressed assets, are you calculating that over, say, 100 activities, a certain number will in fact fail, but that the aggregate will make money?
Well, yeah, but we go in after they have failed, so that absorbs a lot of the risk. I would argue that a properly selected bond that's been defaulted and is trading at 25 cents on the dollar is probably a safer investment than most bonds trading at par, because you have much less downside and, at least in theory, quite a little bit of upside. But what you have to do is to change the management attitude. Companies that have been under stress for quite a while develop what I call a loser's mentality. You'll ask them, what's wrong with your company? And they'll always say something extraneous. It's the union, or it's the class action litigants, or it's the government, or it's the Chinese. They never mention anything that's within their own control. So usually, just by bringing in someone who knows the industry and who doesn't start with the preconception that he can't do anything, that changes the dynamics in and of itself.
What was the difference in your mind between your approach and Michael Milken's approach?
Oh, well, Milken, in a sense, made my career in that I was running investment banking in the U.S. for the Rothschild family at the point when he was developing junk bonds, namely issuing high-yielding securities that were deliberately low quality. And I knew the Rothschilds would never want to underwrite securities like that, but that meant that there would be more defaults because, for example, Federated Department Stores, a fellow named Robert Campo, a developer in Canada, made a hostile bid. He paid $6 billion with a B for it. 97% of it was debt financed. So he had $30 million in a $6 billion buyout. 18 months later, it went bust because there was a recession. So we helped restructure Federated. We helped restructure Texaco, Pan Am, TWA, whole bunch of different companies, the steel industry, the coal industry. But the most momentous one was the Trump Taj Mahal. And that's actually how I met Donald Trump.
From a business side, tell us about that.
Well, Trump was building a startup casino on the boardwalk in Atlantic City. And he got Merrill Lynch and Bear Stearns to underwrite $800 million of mortgage bonds for a venture capital type casino. Only problem was they never made one interest payment. They defaulted before the first coupon came due. So the bondholders were naturally a little cross with that. Then they hired me to try to get their money back. So they hired me on the Thursday before Labor Day weekend of 1990. And as soon as Trump heard the news, he called me. He said, "You have to come down to Atlantic City tomorrow." Well, the last place I wanted to be for Labor Day weekend was in Atlantic City with a bunch of people playing slot machines. But anyhow, I went to the heliport, and there was his chopper, unmistakable in that in red, nail polish type, bright red letters, TRUMP, on the side of the plane. So I get in it. 30-odd minutes later, we're landing in Atlantic City, and he's there waiting to meet me in a big stretch limo. And as I got into it, I noticed there were two flags on the front bumper, a U.S. flag and a Trump flag. And the Trump flag appeared to be slightly larger than the U.S. flag. So it was my first dose of seeing his penchant for attracting attention and very successfully doing so. So we go through this mob scene, we go in the casino, people are having him sign their beanie hats right on their shirt. One woman had a bareback dress and she had him sign her back. Now, what she was going to do with Donald J. Trump in black magic marker pencil on her back, I'll never know. But anyhow, I think it was all part of the buildup because he knew the bondholders were furious about the default, and he correctly figured they might want to get rid of him. So this was all designed to impress me and show me how important he was to the operation. Then we went upstairs to start negotiating, and he never called it a negotiation. He always called it a discussion. But he began by saying, your bonds are trading at 20 cents on the dollar, and your clients will be lucky to get 20 cents at the end. So why don't we just do this? I'll personally guarantee them the 20 cents, and we don't have to have any more discussion. I said, well, Donald, one problem is they've hired me to get them par plus accrued interest plus 100% of the equity in your casino. So we have a little gap that we have to try somehow to close. Well, we went back and forth for a couple hours, and it finally got nowhere. He was stuck at the 20 cents. So I ultimately said, well, Donald, is that it? That's as far as you were prepared to go, at least today. He said, yes, 20 cents. So I said, well, then I'm not going to waste my time arguing with you. I'll call you next week. And I walked out on him. And he tells the story to this day because that was the kind of tactic he was used to using on the other people in negotiation. And he was a little shocked to have it used on him. We then argued for several months publicly, quite publicly, and eventually we were getting very close to our target, but there was still a little gap. So one morning I went over to his office and said, this is our best and final offer. He turned it down. What it was par plus accrued plus 51% of the stock. And I had figured his breaking point probably would be that he didn't want to give up majority ownership. So he rejected it. I said, well, then, Donald, we're going to see you in court. And we parted. I went back to my office, put out a press release, Trump Taj Mahal bondholders holding a very important press conference at the Marriott Marquis Hotel. And we picked the Marriott because it wasn't one of his properties. So as soon as that was on the newswire, he called me and said, what the hell is this? What are you going to say to the people at the press conference? And I said, well, Donald, I told you we would see you in court. We're going to announce that we're filing an involuntary bankruptcy petition against the Taj Mahal, and by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, it's going to be in bankruptcy. He said, well, let me get with my advisors. Got with his advisors, and we backed down a little bit to 49, with him having 51%, worked a few more technical details, and then we had a deal. He then said, but one more thing. And I had spent enough time with him to know the one more thing was usually a zinger. Well, in this case, the one more thing was he said, you must move the press conference to the Plaza Hotel because that was one of his properties. So we did. We had this big love fest with the media. And you can imagine this is a pretty stressful day for me. So I'm getting in the car to be driven home, and the phone rings. This is your mother, said in just about that angry a tone. I said, well, hi, Mom, everything okay? She said, no, everything's not okay. I've been playing mahjong with my lady friends while we were watching that disgraceful TV show that you did just now, the press conference with Trump. And we all agreed that after all those mean things he said about you, you should not make a deal with him. I said, but Mom, that's what I do. That's my job. I was hired to do that. She said, well, if you had only become a lawyer like I always wanted you to, you wouldn't have to hang around with people like that. And she hung up. She hung up on me. She later forgave me for the Trump part, but she never did forgive me for not being a lawyer.
That's hysterical. Given that tough negotiation, were you surprised to end up in the cabinet with Trump?
Well, in between, what happened was this. After the bonds collapsed, Carl Icahn, who, as you know, is a good friend of mine and a good client, he became the biggest bondholder. So we were both on the opposite side from Trump. But we both became early endorsers of Trump when he was running in 2016. And the reason was when you're adversarial to someone in that kind of circumstance, you get to learn what they're made of. And we both concluded he was made of pretty good stuff. So it changed our whole attitude toward him. And then what happened early before the primaries, I was on Squawk Box, and at the end of the discussion about the market, they asked me if Trump were the Republican nominee, would you vote for him? And I said, yes, absolutely. And they were shocked because at that time, Republicans were mostly not going for Trump, and a lot of them, in fact, were Democrats. So I then explained why, and I said, he's the only one who understands that the plight of middle class and lower middle class America has become so severe that they're going to make a change. They're going to vote for someone who's going to do something about the fact they've been losing purchasing power for all these years. And Trump's the only one who recognizes it. So I think he's not only going to be the nominee, I think he's going to be the president. Turned out it was an accurate guess. So naturally, we became pretty friendly. And as you know, I wrote a lot of editorials during the campaign, debated a lot of left-wing think tank people, and lo and behold, ended up in the cabinet.
And did a great job at Congress. Before that, when you were in business, you earned the title King of Bankruptcy. Now, is that a good thing?
Well, Fortune magazine gave me that title, and they meant it to be approvingly. A lot of people have thought it was meant to be a derisive title. I didn't invent the title, so I didn't care about it one way or another, but it was Fortune's way of expressing that we had built up a very big market share in acting on behalf of the victims. I didn't act on behalf of companies that had defaulted. I always represented the bondholders or the equity.
So your interest was trying to minimize the loss to the people who'd provided resources.
Correct. And the strangest part is that even though Drexel doing all those bonds really made my life because I'd spent a lot of time straightening them out, strangest thing is I did Drexel's bankruptcy. Drexel went from being the most profitable firm on Wall Street, earning $500 million after taxes, to bust in 18 months because of the collapse of the junk bond market. So it was very strange. Here, the firm that helped me make a fortune, I'm now representing their unsecured creditors.
I did not know this background, but your mother was, for 50 years, a Democratic county committee woman. Your dad was a local elected official. So you went away, and of course, in Jersey City, where Mayor Frank Hague ran the place for years as a Democrat, your natural background was as a Democrat.
Yes, and so when I first came to New York, I got involved with Democratic politics, and it turned out I was pretty good at fundraising. So at age 29, I was made the treasurer of the Democratic State Committee in New York. As I got more exposure to Democrats, and as they changed from being the party of people who worked to being the party of people who don't want to work, I gradually migrated to the Republican Party. But I didn't make the change until long after my mother was dead, because she had enough trouble getting over me not being a lawyer. Not being a lawyer and being a Republican probably would have killed her prematurely.
One of the great turning points in New York was the race between Dinkins and Giuliani. Where were you at that point?
Well, at that point, I was in transition, but I was also involved with a lot of the cultural institutions in New York. So Punch Sulzberger, who then was running the New York Times, myself, and a man called Marty Siegel, who was a big pension consultant, we formed a group that was designed to be a public-private partnership where the board of the institution would contribute half, the city and the state each a quarter, and they would fund incremental programmatic activity. And to try to get the political sector behind that, we banded together all the board heads of the cultural institutions, not just the big ones, but even the little ones. And we had a session in the New York Times auditorium where each of the two candidates, at that point it was Dinkins and Giuliani, made their presentations. Well, they had never presented anything about culture before, so it came time, you had to brief them what we thought was the program they should do, and nobody wanted to brief Giuliani. So I said, well, I don't think that's fair. At the time, I didn't care for him. I don't think that's fair. I'll go brief him. So I spent 2 hours with him, at the end of which I said, Mr. Giuliani, as you probably know, the cultural community is much to the left of your view. So to try to get it off to a good start, we'll give you a softball question as the number one thing so that you get off to a good start. What would you like for a softball question? And he said, well, let them ask me anything about the opera. A very surprising answer. I said, anything? He said, yes, I really know the opera. So I reported that back, and some young left-winger from, I think, the Metropolitan Opera asked him a very technical question about some obscure opera, and he hit it right out of the ballpark. And that changed my impression of him quite a bit. And then subsequently, since we had developed a bit of relationship, he hired me as an outsider to be his privatization advisor. And we sold off the TV station the city owned. We did a lot of things. So I got quite involved with his administration.
One of the most important things you did when you were secretary is renegotiate NAFTA. At the time, and I want to confess up front, I voted for NAFTA. And it turned out not to work. I mean, most of Trump's critique of NAFTA was right. But what was it like to negotiate with the Mexican government? I mean, you clearly, both with the Canadians and the Mexicans, you were very tough, and you got a very good agreement from the American perspective.
Right. Well, Bob Lighthizer was quite involved in the discussions leading to the USMCA as well. And both he and I felt there is no such thing as free trade. It's a lovely concept. I wish it were the reality, but like so many economic concepts, it just doesn't work in real life. And the reason it doesn't is that every country wants to outgrow what its own natural attributes let it be. So they all become protectionist. And it was a big mistake on our government's part, particularly letting China into the WTO, which is not a NAFTA, but to the WTO without proper enforcement mechanisms. Clinton's theory was that if they were in WTO, they'd abide by the rules, but he didn't have any enforcement, so they didn't. And NAFTA was a much more complicated thing. Both Canada and Mexico are very dependent on the U.S. And in fact, despite big trade balance positive with the U.S., Mexico runs an overall trade deficit. We felt that there were a number of things that could be helpful to the U.S. For one thing, we decided it was better if we had to import from somewhere, let's import from Canada or Mexico, our neighbors, rather than from China or someone who could become an adversary. So that was one idea we had. But there were also a lot of things in the old NAFTA that were foolish. For example, in automotive, which is a huge export business for Mexico, what they did was they specified particular individual parts that had to be made in Mexico for the car to come in duty-free. Well, the problem is when you do that, you're ignoring technological change. So by the time we came into the picture, most of those parts weren't even used in cars anymore. But a lot of semiconductors came in and other things. So we changed that. We made it a rule that a majority of the actual content of the car had to be U.S. produced. And that helped us a lot. And we made similar changes with other things. Now, the problem is Mexico has not been very good at living up to the agreement, and it comes up for renewal pretty soon.
Now, would you be tougher about insisting on enforcement?
Well, they changed the system. We insisted that the courts be the ultimate resolution of disputes, but now they've decided to make the courts be elected by the public. So they've made the courts totally political, and the probability of an American complainant prevailing against a Mexican company under those circumstances is pretty much zero. The other thing, they promised to open up their hydrocarbon sector to American and other natural gas and oil producers, and they've reneged on that. There are a lot of problems, whether it's Trump or it's whoever, running the country, we really need a lot of change, even from the USMCA.
Do you find the Mexicans difficult to negotiate with?
They're lovely people, and the problem is that it's such a highly politicized society, and of late, highly left-wing society. So their intellectual and geopolitical point of view couldn't be more different from ours. So there's a fundamental disconnect between them and us. But one of the things that Trump did in the negotiations, he called in one day the ambassador from Mexico because he was wanting 25,000 troops on the border to help us hold down illegal immigration. And I was there. And the ambassador said, well, I've relayed that request to the president of Mexico, but he doesn't want to do it. And Trump said, well, if he doesn't do it by noon today, we're going to impose huge tariffs on everything that comes in from Mexico. So the ambassador was taken aback, and with me sitting there and agreeing, he knew that was very likely to be what we would try. So he said, well, let me call the president. So he called the president of Mexico, and Trump said, remember, has to be by noontime because I have a very important lunch date and you got to solve this before then. He came back and they gave us the 25,000 troops, which was a great help, as you know, in holding down the illegal immigration because it was keeping a lot of them over there. And what he didn't know was it was a very important lunch, and who it was with was Melania. Trump had been so busy, he hadn't been able to have lunch with Melania for a couple of weeks.
And I suspect you would agree, and certainly I would, that there are moments when our wives become very important lunches.
Yes, absolutely. He wasn't kidding.
That's right. That's great. I want to thank you. You're a great friend, and I always enjoy being with you. And you've had a remarkable career so far, and I suspect there are more adventures ahead. Your new book, Risks and Returns, Creating Success in Business and Life, it's terrific. It's available now on Amazon, bookstores, everywhere. As I said, it's now a bestseller. I really appreciate, Wilbur, your taking the time to be with me.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks. It's good to be on with you. Thank you for giving me so much time.
Thank you to my guest, Wilbur Ross. You can get a link to buy his new book, Risks and Returns, Creating Success in Business and Life, on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan, and our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcasts and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.